Well, I am so excited to study the book of Ruth with you. I love stories, and so I enjoy the Old Testament and the stories that are in there. And so I am excited to look at this much-loved tale of Ruth together in the next 4 weeks. Now, just a little warning, if you're listening to this introductory video at home and there are young children present, you might want to put off listening to it until a time when they are not there, as some of the content on a background level for this book is not really suitable to young ears, just as a warning. Well, have you ever had someone maybe join your family, marry into it or something that just doesn't really seem to fit in? Someone whose personality or culture or whatever is just so different that it kind of feels awkward. Maybe your family is very, very close and very much in each other's personal space and very affectionate. And someone joins the family who's incredibly private and standoffish and doesn't like anyone being affectionate to them. Or perhaps it's a cultural difference of some kind. They don't speak your language, or they grew up in another place and you don't understand them. Or perhaps you're a really conservative family and someone's come in who's loud and outgoing and got tats and piercings and things. And man, it can be kind of hard for a while to feel comfortable with someone who's so very different than ourselves. Well, I want to give you a bit of background on the book of Ruth. And Ruth was a girl who came and joined a community where she was an outsider. She was a foreigner, the odd one out. How do we fit her in? How was she to be accepted? In fact, why should she even be accepted? I want to give you a little bit of information about this story. The author of Ruth is not known for sure, but some scholars speculate it might have been the prophet Samuel. Now, Samuel was a prophet and a judge in Israel, and he had anointed David to be king. But there were a number of years between the day of David's anointing and the day that David ascended the throne, quite a few years. And it may be, if Samuel wrote this book, that he did so during that time period. If it is Samuel, he would have perhaps had two motives for writing us the story of Ruth. A hint of one of them is in Ruth chapter 4, verses 18 to 22, and it's the genealogy of King David. So these verses say, "This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David." The line starts with Perez, who was a son of Judah. Judah was one of the sons of Jacob, and therefore the ancestor of the tribe that bore his name, Judah. And you can read about the blessing that Jacob gave to his sons in Genesis chapter 49. And in verse 10 of that chapter, he said this to Judah: "The scepter would not depart from Judah, nor a ruler's staff from between his feet." Now, this blessing is seen to be God-directed, and is a promise that the king of the nation would come from this tribe. And eventually, so too would their greatest king, the Messiah. And so this book ties David to the line of Judah. It establishes his right genealogically to be king. The genealogy given in Ruth ends with David. It says Jesse is the father of David. It doesn't say the father of David, the king. So that's why some scholars place this in this time of writing as between the anointing of David and his ascent to the throne. Prior to anointing him, Samuel had never heard of David. No one had heard of David. He was a quiet, unassuming little son of a shepherd living in Bethlehem, looking after his father's sheep, the youngest of a huge tribe of sons, and a complete nobody. But then over the years, in between his anointing and his kingship, he went to serve King Saul. He became a part of King Saul's army. He led them in battle, and he became known. And so it is possibly during that time that this is written, because the genealogy doesn't say Jesse is the father of David the king. So he is not yet king, probably, when this book is written. The second thing the book does is it accounts for the presence of a Moabitess in the ancestry of a king. There's a verse in Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, that bars a Moabite and their descendants up to the 10th generation of their descendants from being considered a part of the assembly of the Lord. And yet God is going to choose, or has chosen, David, a man to be king who has a Moabite great-grandmother, just 3 generations back in his family tree. So how do we account for this? Is this okay? This story shows that Ruth did not just move to Israel, but she turned to God, became a believer in God, and that God added her to this family. God put her in the genealogy not only of David, but eventually of the Messiah. The timing of the story itself is not really clear, but it is placed during the time of the Judges, and we're told right at the very beginning of chapter 1. The period of the Judges covered several hundred years, and it was a time of spiritual defeat and instability in Israel. The nation it is a time period defined by one verse that God gives in the book a couple of times of Judges, that is, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that generally is, they did evil. And so through that time period, the nation would fall into idolatry. It would fall away from God. And God would send, to correct them, God would send an oppressive nation against them. And they would be enslaved, or they would be inhabited, or they would have to pay tribute of their crops and their money to this conquering power. And after a while, being in distress, they would turn to God and they would pray, and God would deliver them. He would send a judge, which was basically, to start with, at least a military leader, someone who would lead them in battle against their enemies and bring them victory with God's help against their enemy. And then that judge would lead them to follow God through the rest of the years of the life of that judge. And then when the judge died, the nation would usually fall away from obedience to God, fall back into idolatry, and the whole cycle would repeat itself. And the cycle goes round and round and round and round a number of times in the book of Judges. It's a depressing account of Israel's inability to stay faithful to God. There's a little bit of a clue as to the timing as to when in the period of the Judges it might have happened, given in the first few verses of the book of Ruth. I'm going to read Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, and then verse 6. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. And then verse 6, when she, that is the wife, Naomi, heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. So there's a famine in Israel, but it appears that there's food in Moab. And that's why Elimelech took his family to Moab. There's food there. It's an easier life, whereas here it's a struggle. Now Moab, or the boundaries of Moab, are only 75 miles from Bethlehem. Not a huge distance. That would be like from Vancouver to Chilliwack, about 150 kilometers. So it seems highly unlikely that the famine is the result of an environmental condition like a lack of rain, because if there was a lack of rain, if there was a drought in Vancouver, you would expect there to be a drought in Chilliwack. And same here. If there was a drought due to a lack of rain in Judah, then there would be a drought in Moab as well. And so whatever caused the famine, it had to have something other than an environmental cause. Now there's a possible connection to a specific time period in the book of Judges. And you can read about this in Judges chapter 6 if you're interested. And it's the story of Gideon. Israel has done evil in the eyes of the Lord. They've turned to idolatry. God has sent the Midianites against them, and the Midianites have conquered Israel, and they're coming regularly into Israel's territory, and they're taking their crops, they're damaging their crops, they're taking their livestock, and they're decimating the land. And it says in that chapter, they came so often that they devastated the land and it was impoverished. So that means that in an agricultural society, that means there's no food. The crops, which is how you make money, your livestock, which is how you make money, are being taken from you. And so there's no food in Israel, not due to a lack of rain, but due to these destroying Midianites who are coming in and taking their crops. We see in the early verses of Ruth that I read that the Lord, it says, has given his people food in Judah. That's what Naomi heard while she was in Moab. This would tie in with this time period, that the famine happened when the Midianites were coming and taking this, and then Gideon is caused by God to rise up as a leader. He goes and takes an army, a very small army, against the Midianites and fights them, and he, with God's help, defeats the Midianites, and Israel now is no longer being destroyed on a regular basis by these invaders, and now there would be food again. So God would have given them the food by removing their enemies. And so that might place this story as taking place during the life of Gideon and after the Midianites were removed from the land. Now let's just give you a little bit of background on the Moabites. Why are the Moabites so rejected? Why did God say they were not to be a part of the congregation or the assembly of Israel? The Moabites are descendants of Abraham. They are related to Israel, therefore, in a bigger family way, if you like. You might remember from Genesis chapter 19, the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham had a nephew named Lot who had gone to live in Sodom. And when God was going to destroy Sodom, he sent angels to take Lot and his family out of Sodom. But Lot's married children would not leave, and so only those living in his household were required by Lot to go with him and the angels as they fled. And that was his wife and his 2 unmarried daughters who were still living in the house. As they fled the city, his wife longingly looked back at the Sodom and was turned into a pillar of salt. And only Lot and his 2 daughters escaped the destruction of the city. They ended up living in a cave, and the 2 daughters decided, with a complete lack of trust in God, that the only way they were ever going to be able to have children is if they had them by their father. And so they got their father drunk on 2 successive nights, and each one of Lot's daughters had a son by him. And one of those was named Moab. And he is the ancestor of the Moabite people. So they had a rather disturbing and dark beginning as a nation. On top of that, while Israel was in the desert, in the 40 years that they wandered between Egypt and entry into the land of Canaan, there was a deliberate attempt made on the part of Moab to defeat Israel. And so the first thing they tried to do is to hire Balaam to curse Israel, and Balaam was unable to do so because God prevented him from doing it and forced him to bless them instead. And if you want to read this, it's Numbers 22 through, I think, about chapter 25 is this story. And so they came up with a second plan, and they sent Moabite and Midianite women, because this looks like some sort of a joint effort on the part of these 2 nations. They sent them into the congregation of Israel to seduce the men of Israel. And the men of Israel committed sexual immorality with the women of Moab. Now, this was not just sexual immorality. It makes it clear that this was tied to the worship of Baal of Peor, and that Israel began to worship the idols of Baal during this time. The Lord, of course, was extremely angry with Israel. A plague broke out against them, and the only thing that stopped the plague was that an Israelite man brought a Midianite woman into the camp and was actually indulging himself right in plain view in the camp, and one of the priests took a spear and thrust it through both the Israelite man and the Midianite woman and killed them both, and the Lord stopped the plague. And so this was a pretty terrible situation as well. Now, Baal is a name that is often used to a number of the Canaanite gods. And Baal means actually, and I think I've heard Larry Perkins say this as Baal. So if you're maybe more properly in pronouncing it, that might be how you say it. But it's a name that applied to a number of the gods of the Canaanites, and because it actually means Lord. But specifically, the one that Moab worshipped is called Chemosh. And Chemosh is a fertility god, as is all of the Baals, and he is worshipped partly through public sexual acts that are part of the temple practice, including temple prostitutes and so on. And on top of that, he's one of the Baals that was worshipped by the sacrifice or the burning of alive of infants. And so this is a horrible, depraved, violent, cruel religion. And very much God is opposed to this and wants it out of his people. He wants them kept away from this. And so that is why he barred Moabites from the assembly of the congregation. He doesn't want Israeli men going and taking Moabite women into Israel and then having them bring their gods with them and introduce this terrible religion to Israel. It's a horrible religion, but because of the sexual component, it's an attractive one. And so that's why God barred Moab from the congregation of Israel. And this is the culture in which Ruth grew up. So, what should we look for as we go through the book of Ruth? Well, for one thing, the book emphasizes Ruth's foreignness. It calls her Ruth the Moabitess over and over. There is an effort made to emphasize the fact that she does not belong to Israel, that she is a barred Moabite. The author wants us to remember where she came from before she turned to God. She had no right to the blessing of God. This is the background against which the grace of God is put on display in her life. In seeing her foreignness, the exclusion that she should have experienced, we get to see how huge is God's grace to her. So look for the ways in which God's grace is in her or to her is put on display. She is a symbol of all of us. Due to our sin, we too have no right to access to God. We too should be excluded, and yet God's grace is extended to us to bring us in. So we are Ruth in many ways. Look for how God works behind the scenes in this book. Nowhere in the book does it overtly say God did this or God caused that. The only time that we see anything that God did being referred to, it's when other people say something about what God did, but it doesn't give us any direct evidence that God did anything. And yet, you can't help but see God at work behind the scenes and in the details and in the circumstances of this story. And there is a name for this. This is the doctrine of the providential care of God. God's providence is always at work in circumstances and in unseen ways to accomplish his plans. He's seeing this in Ruth's life will help us to see the way that God works behind the scenes in our own lives, things that we often overlook as just happenstance or circumstances. There's a strong theme of redemption in this story. This is the story of salvation on display in a unique way. The doctrine of redemption, whenever you hear salvation referred to as God's redemption, is always the cost that is being emphasized. To redeem something, there is a cost. You have to pay a high price. And this story shows the act of redemption, not through blood sacrifice, but in a different form of payment. So watch how God sets out to redeem Ruth and Naomi from their situation. Naomi is a huge part of the story, as much a part of it as is Ruth. In fact, some scholars have said you could just as easily and perhaps even more appropriately have named it the Book of Naomi. But in calling it after a Moabite woman, again, there is this underlying example of God's grace. But don't overlook Naomi, because God is working out things for her in this story as much as he is for Ruth. And there are big lessons in the story about how God brings about blessing. We can learn lots about how he blesses in our lives and how to look for or wait for his blessing. It should increase our faith to study this book and to help us see what steps we need to take to enjoy his fruitfulness in our lives. So there you go, a little bit of background on Ruth. For next week, please read chapter 1 and do the questions provided, and I look forward to discussing it with you soon.